Greetings, everybody. You know, I thought there'd be a pretty good turnout to this session. I think most people are passionate about carbon-friendly fishing.
Yeah, that's my favorite topic.
So actually, that was our attempt at an April Fool's joke. You are in the right place if you're here for forestry and a status check on forestry. My name is John Nickerson, and I'm your moderator today. I am a forester. I live up in Northern California. My forestry career had me working with the Forest Service, with industrial landowners, small landowners, nonprofits. And around 2003, my career took a change in trajectory when I had the opportunity to work on the first protocol, the forest carbon offset protocol in California. And that trajectory took me to where I am today. I haven't veered off course yet. I do continue to do other forestry work as well. And of course, if you look at that pathway, there's been a lot of successes. It's pretty amazing to think that there's even a carbon market. If you would have been in the room in 2003, there were just a few of us at the table. Then came AB 32, and then everybody wanted to participate. We had a bigger work group back then. The protocol ended up becoming the Climate Action Reserves version. Ended up getting adopted by California for compliance purposes. I also did a lot of work in Mexico that led to the forest protocol in Mexico. So I think if you look back, you know, it's pretty amazing to see where projects are. We have projects all over the United States. There's 400 projects in Mexico, reserve projects. So that has been very exciting. But as we all know, it hasn't been without its fair share of challenges. And I think that's what we're here to talk about today. So let me tell you how this is going to work. We're not going to do a normal panel. We started out that way. We are going to go fishing. No, I'm kidding. No, we started out talking about the key points that each of our panelists wanted to cover. And then we said, let's do it in a different way. So how we're going to do this is through myth busting or fact or fiction. You know, they're going to be either breaking a myth, or maybe the myth is not a myth, or fact or fiction. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to put out maybe what might be a provocative statement, and our panelists are going to react to it. And I bet you guys will be reacting to the statements in your own heads. And I hope so, because it's my hope that you guys will be developing your own statements, that I'm going to give you the opportunity to also throw out some statements to our panelists. And they haven't practiced with what you're going to say. They've seen what I have here on paper. So that's how it's going to work. Before we get started, I'd like to say one thing that I found in working with this group of panelists. You know, I've known of these people for a long time. We're old warriors. We've been at this a long time. You can see by our calluses. But what I found is, you know, I don't know if you guys play the New York Times Connections game. Well, obviously, there's a connection with forestry. We're all passionate about forestry. But I found another connection, and I doubt that anybody here will figure that one out, so I'm just going to give it away. It's Africa. So each of us has our own Africa story. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Jason was a Peace Corps volunteer in Gambia.
Gabon.
Oh, Gabon. I'm sorry. Gabon. Jennifer has a son who's a Peace Corps volunteer in Uganda. Anajua kusema Kiswahili. You don't know. No. And then I know, of course, this is where we break the Peace Corps connection, but it still is an Africa connection. Pedro was in Kenya and spent some time there.
Yeah, I worked for UNEP for about a year, working for UNEP regarding wildlife and forestry protection.
So there's our connection. So our panelists, I'm going to let them introduce themselves briefly before we get into breaking myths. We have Pedro Morales, and I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. Jason Gray, Jennifer Jenkins. So Jennifer, let's hear a brief introduction from you, please.
Of course. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I understand that we're like the last thing between you and cocktail hour, so we'll try to keep it light. Because forestry is all about being Light. Okay, so I'm Jennifer Jenkins. I'm currently the Chief Science Officer for Rubicon Carbon. If you don't know Rubicon, we are a vertically integrated carbon credit investment and management firm. We were founded in late 2022, so we've been at this about 3.5 years. Our sort of value proposition is that we add the credits that we're not a broker per se. We have the credits that we invest in. We keep them on our own balance sheet, and we sell them as part of portfolios that are called Rubicon carbon tons. We also sort of are intermediate offtake agreements, right, for customers for buyers that are interested in making long-term investments in high-quality projects. So in that way, we make investments, and then we sell the sort of resulting carbon credit projects as offtake agreements to buyers. John, did you want us to also talk about our background and the career piece, or is that
Just briefly,
later?
yeah.
Okay.
No, go ahead and do it, yeah.
Yeah, so I started my career as a scientist. I have a PhD in ecosystem ecology, and spent the first 20 years of my career in and out of government and academia, and sort of really felt ultimately things weren't moving as fast as I wanted to, right? So as I wanted them to, and I wasn't having the sort of kind of direct impact that I wanted to have. And that sort of is my journey into the carbon market. I joined the private sector about 10 years ago, and really, had a variety of sort of chief sustainability officer roles in different sort of private sector firms, and really, I think there's another opportunity to talk about what makes me passionate about this, right? Because I don't need to go there right now.
You can go there right now.
I will go there right now.
What makes you passionate about forestry and making sure this works?
I have dedicated my career to climate action, right, in various ways, and it hasn't always been in the carbon market. But I feel passionate about the importance of making this a livable planet for for us and our descendants. So that's kind of the thing that has driven me, throughout my career. And the carbon market, I think, is a really fantastic tool to create efficient, emissions reductions around the world. And I really believe that strongly, despite all the odds, as it turns out.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, Jason, what brought you here, and why are you passionate about the topic?
I am here to fish, John. I love to fish, and there is a connection between fishing and trees. I am here really because the same passion that Jen just mentioned in terms of trying to figure out ways together to really protect ecosystems, because we all depend on them, and so many people really depend on them even more than I do. I come to this space having started as a kind of ecology undergrad, studied ecology and French, which somehow led me to live in Francophone Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer for a while, working on wildlife protection and environmental education. And I decided that the best next step was to become a lawyer, not to work as a lawyer. I thought it would be great for policy initiatives. So I came back to the U.S., went to law school, and ended up sort of randomly working for the California Air Resources Board starting in 2010. And when I came in, because of my sort of forestry background, the board tapped me to work on the offsets protocol as it was being adopted into the overall compliance market. And I worked on the compliance market for a little over 12 years, first as a lawyer and then as a manager, and then I oversaw the whole program for about 6 years. And I think that experience of working with many of you, working with lots of other folks on how you design a compliance market for environmental good, really kind of helped show me that the only way we do this is together, in building the trust and relationships and the hard-fought battles and learning from each other, in particular around the nuances for protection of land-based carbon, is really what's kept me passionate about working on here. I left the board about 4 years ago to continue working with government. I work now as the project manager for the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, which is an initiative that Governor Schwarzenegger started in 2008, trying to help tropical jurisdictions primarily interact in this space as well, either through offset markets or through other types of financing. So I get to work with 45 governors from 11 countries and growing, including California as a founding member, and really helping support learning between civil servants, between partners, between hopefully more and more investors on how to do this together. I think one of the things that was most formative in my experience on carbon markets really was around California's engagement with Native American tribes, in particular here in California, on the design of the carbon market. They were not included. That was not part of the discussion. That was a federal matter. And the tribes came to us at ARB and said, what the hell are you doing? We have important forests. We want to be engaged on a sovereign-to-sovereign level basis. So building that trust was critical to the success, I think, of the California program. I mean, more than half of the credits in the forest space in the compliance market are tribal or Alaska Native Corporation. And I think that experience has been really, really helpful to translate to other parts of the world as you're building these relationships of trust, which take time. Even though we know we don't have a lot of time, they're so important. And that's what keeps me passionate today. So thanks.
Thank you, Jason. So Pedro, what brought you here? Why are you passionate about forestry, and what are you doing now?
Well, I came for the drinks, but that's still not happening. But anyway, I mean, I have been helping the Climate Action Reserve for a long time. As a victim myself of capillary deforestation, I'm always interested in the topic for a long time. I have participated both with governments, with private law firms, and with the academic sector in advising on carbon projects and on the establishment of carbon laws, regulations, and carbon markets themselves. For a long time, when I had hair and a black beard, well, only one of those two is true, I have been helping the Climate Action Reserve for the establishment of the first protocol in Mexico, which was a huge challenge attending to many legal restrictions that we have in Mexico. So what we thought that initially would be something impossible or unlikely to happen, now we are in the third version of the first protocol, which I don't know how many there will be, because it's always a continuous process of improvement. But we are in the third version, and we have seen so many projects that have helped so many communities acquire resources for the improvement of their lives that I'm very proud of it. So it's always been a great pleasure of me of collaborating in these kind of projects.
Thank you, Pedro. So now you know your panelists. And here we go. For those of you that just came in, we are going to be asking the panelists a question, and they're going to respond to it as if they're busting a myth or telling us whether it's fact or fiction. So here we go. Let's get it started. Pedro, the first one, I'm going to start with you. Other panelists, please feel free to weigh in after he comments, okay? So the first one is, forests are hard to get right in carbon markets. We should focus our efforts on other things besides forests. Pedro, what's your response?
That's total myth. I mean, otherwise what I have dedicated my life would be a total mess first. But carbon projects come in many ways. We have the most easy ones that we saw with the Clean Development Mechanism when the Kyoto Protocol was still an issue. But those are pretty plain. But that does not mean that they are the ones to be implemented. That's the future of carbon. Forest projects have so many benefits other than carbon themselves, and that's why they have a much greater demand than other projects. With forest projects, we see benefits from biodiversity, we see benefits from water, we see benefits from social impacts they have, from habitat protection. So they are the best all-around projects that we can have. Even if the carbon part is very complicated and complex, and even in the beginning, when we were still negotiating, when I was in the Ministry of Environment in Mexico, we were still negotiating the Kyoto Protocol and attending to nature-based projects, saying, well, but there's permanence issues, there's carbon leakage, all of that stuff. I think it's complex, but we have to try to sell these projects not only for the carbon part, but all those other benefits that they have. And that's why we really have to make the greatest effort to protect these kind of projects in specific.
You know, I think that was a pretty easy one, right? Pretty lightweight. So I guess, Jennifer and Jason, let's hold off because I think you actually responded to that in your introduction. So I just wanted to get them warmed up. So here we go. Jennifer, removal credits are better and higher quality than emissions reductions. You want me to repeat it?
No, this is one of my favorite topics. False.
Right. No. There is no right answer.
And I guess there are lots of ways to think about this, right? One way is the bathtub analogy, and I won't sort of maybe I'll save that for another response. But here's the thing, right? I mean, the market right now prefers removals, right? The market has a sense somehow that removals are higher quality, but I think it's really a relic of the concern around baselines, which has largely been solved. Okay. And here is why we absolutely cannot, this distinction between removals and reductions, in forestry particularly, and I'm not talking about superpollutant elimination, I'm not talking about ECDR, I'm not talking about what happens when we do residual emissions at 2050. That's not what I'm talking about. This is more, right now, 10 to 15% of the emissions globally right now come from forest conversion, primarily in tropical regions. Simply, we will not get to net zero as a society if we continue to cut down the forest, okay? So the emissions reductions credits that involve protection of standing stocks are critically important for us to invest in right now. And that's just on the net zero side, right? I'm not even talking about the biodiversity benefits, the community development benefits, the air and water protection benefits that Pedro so eloquently described. It's simply, we absolutely have to protect our standing stocks. And the best way I know to do that is to get carbon finance into these projects. And so I strongly believe, I am troubled by the increasing sort of focus on removals myself. And I think we really need to sort of bring back the emissions reductions credits.
Thank you. I was kind of thinking I should have had you all raise your hands if you agreed with it beforehand, but maybe now you're biased. How many people think she's right? Okay. Things are moving in the right direction. Anybody want to respond to that? Jason, you got any thoughts on that point?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we used to talk about this at the Air Board of like 10 to 15% is more emissions than the global transportation sector. I mean, we will not survive without doing this. So,
how do we convince everybody else, the market and the critics? I think you mentioned it, that you're right, Jennifer. It comes down to getting the baseline right. There's been some perhaps mistakes in the past, and that's what's been the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of move toward dynamic baselining is really critical, right? So far, we've seen that in VM45, we've seen that in VM47, and sort of the other, and isometric, right? Some of the other registries. I think that's a huge step forward in the direction of credibility and hopefully support and respect for these kinds of projects. VM47 obviously is a removal, methodology. So what we don't know, what we haven't figured out, is we have VM48, right, which is the sort of jurisdictional version of the RED Plus methodology in the Vera, the Vera system. But that's just a jurisdictional baseline, right? That I don't know, right, and I know people are working on this, if the dynamic baseline approach would work for a RED Plus project. That seems like, I haven't to say that out loud, right, maybe controversial, yeah.
I do have a myth buster about dynamic baselines.
Oh, you do?
So, yeah,
okay. We'll save that for later.
So I think I'd like to see the audience weigh in with hands here first, and then I'm going to go to Jason. So Jason, you can warm up and see what they say, or get ready. So number 3 here, jurisdictional approaches are preferable to project-based approaches. Yes? No? Okay. All right. Jason, how do you want to respond to that?
well, I think there was only 3 people total that raised their hands, so I'm going to respond how I want to respond here.
Yeah.
I mean, I work for the group of governors looking at jurisdictional approaches, but I don't think it's a simple, I'm going to give the lawyer answer. It's really not an either or, we have to do both. The organization I help support is really looking at how do you set up the policies, laws, community development processes, consultation processes at scale, which as a lawyer and a governance person, I think is absolutely critical to having long-term impact, including permanence issues. I think jurisdiction scale does help address some of the leakage concerns, in my view, some of the permanence concerns. And so for long-term durable, I hate the word durable, I'm sorry. For long-term policy that's going to last and actually get us where we need to go, jurisdictional approaches are absolutely critical. That's where governance comes in, where government comes in, where communities have recourse if there's an issue that the government can address. And I think that's where a lot of folks are really trying to see how to drive finance, carbon finance, but other types of finance as well, into making sure the longer-term protection of forests at that scale happens. I think there's some really great methodologies, including the Art Trees methodology, to do that. And from my perspective, dynamic baseline doesn't need to be part of that process. The methodology needs to be very transparent about what the risks are and what's going on in the methodology. At the same time, projects are also incredibly critical. RED Plus projects in communities where good developers are working together with the community. It drives benefits directly to that community. A jurisdictional program can as well, but it may be more diffuse. So the critical thing, in my perspective, is driving every type of finance we can into protecting forests and helping communities have good livelihoods and find alternatives to the current economic status quo that's cutting down our trees. Another critical piece of that, though, is if you're going to have projects and a jurisdictional program, you have to have ways to account together in a nested approach that makes sense. Otherwise, you lose credibility for both. So.
Thank you. Anybody else want to?
I have a question. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What happens if the government, can people trust the government? Can we trust the government, right? I mean, because one of the arguments, and I think it's a good one, right? But I do wonder, one of the arguments that you gave in favor of a jurisdictional approach is that the communities and the project develop, there's recourse, right? There's governance that we can believe in. Presumably the government will be putting resources into protection of that project or protection of those, I don't know what you call it, I guess it is a project at a jurisdictional scale. But can we always trust the government, I guess is my question.
It's a very loaded question these times. I guess what I would say is I don't think every government has the capacity to do a jurisdictional RED Plus program. So it's really dependent on where government is showing that willingness and how do you help them build that to last past an administration. I think it's the same questions we face here in the U.S. at the federal level. How do you make sure that policies and laws and momentum can continue in a good direction as administrations change? I'll just give the small example from our task force. We have 45 members currently. We have 29 governors going through elections this year and next year. That's a lot of jurisdictions changing hands. And in many places, that means their entire team will change as the governor leaves office. So I think the same challenge works for projects, though. If you have a new administration coming in that's not supportive of a project, you can have the same issues. So I think the very cool work, the very hard work from a governance perspective is how do you help build institutions, in the very large sense institutions, meaning protection for civil servants as they're working together, spaces for those civil servants to go into private sector or into academia or into nonprofits to stay in that policy space to keep it moving forward. In our little network of 45 governors right now, we've been around for 17 years. So there is some lessons, I think, that we can share of how do you help make sure that that momentum goes forward. But I don't think we would ever pretend that every jurisdiction has the level of willingness or capability or ability to wait as the bar gets raised higher here and then changed over here for a jurisdictional RED program. But some of them do.
I think, it would be very similar to political will compared with the establishment of carbon markets. It's more or less the same. Also, a problem with jurisdictional is that you don't attend many times to the differences in land rules that you have from place to place, especially in the case of Mexico, where we have land ownership, which may be communal, and the reality is very different in the north and in the south of Mexico. So establishing a jurisdictional program, for example, in the case of Mexico, is very, very complicated, whereas a program-based approach is easier to get that tailor-made.
Can I just respond really quick? The folks we work with are really at the subnational level, including in now soon to be 8 states in Mexico. So I think there are ways to recognize those regional differences at still a very large jurisdictional scale, but maybe not at the national level. So, and clearly subnational would have to nest into national policy as well, but I think there's ways to address some of those kind of regional differences.
Okay, I think that sounds good. I think that this one might inspire some thoughts from the audience here. And I'm going to start with you, Pedro, when it comes back. Okay, so the advent of ratings agencies has provided a beneficial service to credit buyers by providing solid, transparent frameworks for project evaluations. Who's in agreement with that? Anybody in disagreement? Okay.
I mean, I'm a lawyer, and as such, I don't have that much contact with ratings agencies, but again, many of my clients use them. They do have a little bit of a use. As we know, environmental law in general is constantly changing. You have new requirements both from market and science, which changing the protocol, as the three of us know from especially, they may be very complicated. So whereas a protocol, law, or whatever takes a long time to be modified, the ratings agencies may incorporate those ideas that either the market or science brings and bring that more quickly to the table. As for transparency and that, I think that probably developers have a better idea of that with the ratings of the agencies. What I don't like as a lawyer is, of course, as a lawyer, you want to expect that if you have a project and you follow certain rules, you can sell that as is. And what I don't like as a lawyer, again, and you can see that with the ESG criteria and certifications now, which is something similar, is that you have so many criteria that you don't know what you're getting really when you're a buyer if you are not very well connected and understand very well what the quality of a certain rating agency is or not.
So yeah, so again,
So
Jason,
Jason,
it looks like you're leaning in. Do you think ratings agencies have saved the day?
I mean, my perspective, I'm not a buyer, so I'm certainly not yet. I mean, I think the challenge here is really, as Pedro said, like as the rating agencies improve in their expertise of specific methodologies, I think that can help. I'm going to respond a little bit from my former government hat, sitting in the hot seat when lots of folks critiqued things the government did in CARB. It's easy to critique a methodology, and this is not a comment on the specific rating agencies, but it's easy for folks who may not know all the nuances of a very complex methodology to critique it and to come up with their own methodology. I think as rating agencies improve in their understanding in the ecosystem in which these methodologies are being developed, I'm hoping that will help. But I think it's still really early days.
And you get to see that, you get to see that a lot nowadays with buyers that are more sophisticated and they have their own criteria besides not only CAR or BERA requirements. You see that they have a list of requirements to increase some additionality or permanence requirements that go beyond what the carbon standard requirements. Sorry to interrupt, Jennifer.
No, that's fine.
I'm going to step in to defend the ratings agencies for a second. You guys, this is a tiny market. This is a baby market. This is like an infant market, right? And if we wanted to grow up into a grown-up market that's similar to the financial market, we need to mimic a lot of the things that we have in the financial market. One of those things is a ratings agency, right? If you're going to buy a stock or a bond or make an investment, there's like Moody's, there's Standard & Poor's, and these are like well-respected, accepted ways of understanding sort of quality for particular products in the financial market. If we want to actually use these credits as commodities and sort of securitize them and make them and make this market grow, right? We need a lot of things, right? We need, contracts that make sense. We need, data structures that can be portable and interoperable. But we also need ratings agencies. And I think, we're sort of treating this market right now in its infancy as like a very bespoke project by project market. And that's just too cumbersome and time consuming and difficult. And buyers are spending, 90% of their time diligencing individual projects because the market that's just how the market works today. I think we really need to grow it up. And the ratings agencies are part of that.
Okay. I don't know if that changed anybody's opinion out there, but there you have some thoughts. Okay, this one, no offense to project developers out there, but we have this one on the list. So here we go, and I'm gonna start with Jennifer on this one.
I'm just going to say John wrote these questions.
And I want to know who's the developer.
That's not really true. Okay, project developers take advantage of landowners. Wait. Anybody, maybe we're going to get some votes from the project developers. What do you guys think? Yes? Nobody wants to admit that. How about no? Okay, they don't. All right.
I guess let me say this. I think there's the potential for project developers to take advantage of landowners. I think there certainly could be. For example, one question that a landowner might not know to ask if they sort of agree to a certain payment for undertaking a certain activity, right? Because they're not in the market, right? Whether you're a farmer or a forest landowner, you might not, as a regular sort of citizen out there in the world, you might not know to ask the developer, how much money are you making on this project? Right? And that may not feel to you as a citizen like a polite question to ask. But I absolutely, whenever somebody comes to me and says, I'm thinking about enrolling in X and Y project, I'm like, okay, great. Ask the developer, what proportion of what they're making you are going to see, right? And how, and I think people may not be sophisticated enough to ask those questions. Now, I'm not here to tell you that that's actually happening. I don't know. But I think the opportunity certainly is there. So that's my answer.
I would like to chip in here because that was a big issue in Mexico with the authorities. A couple of years back, the Federal Ministry of Environment was not very fond of carbon projects in Mexico. They didn't like carbon markets that much. And one of the ideas was developing a regulation that would establish just a fixed maximum amount for developers, because they said, well, there are cases in which developers are taking 80% of the credits, whatever. But I think that has been managed by the market. If there's a project and any buyer wants to buy credits from a developer that is keeping 85% of the credits, that's not going to happen. I think that the market has been managing that on its own. And establishing a regulation to prevent that is very complicated because at the end of the day, how fair is very complicated to fix it specifically. And if you establish a very low percentage that developers can take, developers will invest in other countries. So that's an important issue that has taken place, at least in Mexico. But I think that market has been handling that more or less well.
I'll just say that, in some of the places that I work with governments, like as soon as there's a change in policy, that look at Bolivia right now, there is a rush of really great folks and some folks that are trying to take advantage. I think that's just the truth. I think as it develops, though, there is more sophistication as governments think about how to make sure they're protecting communities. For those that think about that, I think that's just the evolution that ends up happening, hopefully. And I think the folks in this room, your job, in my view, is really to make sure that that's what's happening in the right direction. And from my experience with project developers is that's what you're doing. But there are some carbon cowboys in the bad sense, and we see that in the tropics all the time.
But you get to see those projects, they never sell, mainly. When you see a project, and I have seen this 85%, I have seen that in practice, but they never sell credits at the end of the day.
You know, one of the things that we put in the Mexico Forest Protocol was the requirement for a project coordinator that was supposed to be a link between the Climate Action Reserve and the community. Well, in cases of either a comunidad or an ejido, the communal management. And that was intended to try and, address that potential issue of, abuse being taken on the community. But I think one of the things that we need to do, and I'm now acting as a panelist, but one of the things I think we need to do is do a better job of working with those project coordinators to get them together and train them so they know what market prices are, they know what typical contracts look like. So we have a mechanism, but we can work with it better. So any other comments on this, or are we done?
No, and again, ejidos, I think that they have become more and more understanding of these kind of projects as well. The first agreements that we drafted for ejidos and developers were 5 pages long, and nowadays they tend to shadow the purpose that the developer will have to execute with the buyer, and it has become much more complex. But at the end of the day, again, I think ejidos are much better educated on these kind of topics that they were when we made the first protocol, John, definitely.
So
and that prevents these kind of abuses.
Thank you, Pedro. Now that you guys see how this worked, have you guys been working on your own myths for busting? Does anybody have one they want to throw at the panel? Okay, I'm going to ask. Okay, good. What do you have?
Harvesting reduces permanence.
Okay, I'm going to say it again so everybody in the back can hear it. The question was, harvesting reduces permanence. Can we also rephrase that and include, should we allow harvest as part of a carbon project? Okay. All right, who wants to take that one on?
I think that was mine.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
You get it.
So yeah, there are some projects that allow and sort of encourage harvesting as part of the project, and some projects that sort of are more on the restoration side or just sort of, planting or conserving maybe a more, a less timber-friendly kind of species. My first comment is people use wood. Wood products are critical for society, right? We use newspaper, we use books. There are lots of products that are made from timber. We use timber for construction, right? Lots of products that are made from timber in the forest economy. So the forest economy is really important. Second, there are good ways to account for if you're concerned about storing carbon long term, there are good ways and reasonable ways to account for long-term storage in harvested wood products. They're not perfect. They're models. Models are replicas of the real world, right? It's not actually measurements, but they're reasonable approximations. So I believe there is room for a mix, right, of improved forest management projects that allow for harvesting and sort of restoration projects that really encourage restoration of maybe non-timber species. Those are all valid uses for carbon finance.
Anybody else? Anybody want to comment on the leakage aspect if you don't harvest? You want to say something?
No, maybe you would like to.
Yeah, that's a more technical
Well,
question, John.
John, the forester.
It sounds like you want to talk about that.
Well, to me, it's an obvious one. If you take land out of production, that's how we account for leakage, and we have to at least address for leakage if we're not going to harvest, right? In a case where the baseline included harvest. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, yeah.
Should we
Sheldon.
account for the fact that when you do take it out, there is other places where you are appreciating the value of land, and it could be creating positive leakage.
Okay, Sheldon, I think I'll try and repeat that so people in the back, can you say it again louder? Just say it loud.
So when you take if you're going to take, fiber out of a wood basket, there's obviously the argument that, hey, those wood paper products have to come from somewhere else, but you also have an impact on the value of the land as forests. And so I guess I'm asking, should carbon markets try to crack that nut of figuring out where positive leakage is actually happening?
Does anybody want to take that on?
I think it's too complicated. So I don't think I would want to tackle it.
Yeah, it seems like where things are difficult, we make sure we take a conservative approach to accounting. You have to be pretty sure about yourself before you can claim a benefit, but I've thought about that too. Okay, this group here, besides being on stage for this panel, we've been working together on permanence. So here comes the permanence questions. Number one, and this is going to start with Jason.
Oh boy.
Mechanisms for permanence should be developed that maintain the removal or the emission reduction forever.
All right, I have a maybe different reaction than other folks to this. To me, having helped manage a compliance market, which has a whole different risk rating, it has a whole different confidence rating on because it's a compliance market, it's really important to define terms and a methodology that reflect practical reality of how you implement something, not just a dictionary definition or not just a way that you're looking at, in my view, something that you just can't implement. So it's not just a scientific definition. It has to be based in science and defensible, but something that actually can be implemented. So I think the forever piece there is what I'm reacting to. And what I see developing in lots of different discussions, including in some discussions we've had kind of within this group, is how do you make those nuances? And as a lawyer, I'm more comfortable with nuances, I think, than other people. That's just my training. But I think it's critical to recognize that when you're designing a methodology, it has to be able to be used. And I have an issue when folks say, oh, there's other types of projects where it is forever. I mean, geological sequestration is not forever. What if there's an earthquake? What if there's something else that happens? So I think the key for any methodology is finding ways to mitigate reversals. And I think there's lots of different tools that exist in the existing methodologies. There's some really exciting things happening in the insurance sector right now. There's some folks in the audience here who are on working groups that are really finding new ways to look at insurance, the permanence trust, different things like that. But I guess to me, that's the critical piece is how are you insuring against reversal risk, which exists for almost every project type except for maybe gas destruction. So.
Go ahead.
I'll go. I guess I take a pretty 35,000 foot view here on this one. We already established that protecting nature is critical, and we need to protect nature right now. And we need to do that, frankly, first. And a lot of the methods and sort of credit types that we have today, I would argue we don't really have, because they're like a lot of the direct air capture and sort of other more permanent credit types are simply not yet ready for prime time. So I take every time that a question like this comes up, right? I take that, what do we want as a society, right? If our goal is to mitigate the climate crisis, let's focus on nature. And if we're a little hung up on whether or not nature is permanent, let's find ways to make it more permanent, right? And one of the things that we've been doing as part of the Business Alliance for Climate Action, which I encourage all of you to join, is advocating for something called effective permanence, right? Because there's legislation, particularly right now in the EU, that defines nature as temporary, which is unfortunately going to sort of ace out a lot of the nature-based credits from consideration in some of the upcoming EU policies. So what we're arguing for is saying, don't do that. You can say nature is effectively permanent as long as you adopt some of these other sort of safeguard mechanisms, extra buffer pools, insurance. The permanence trust is a new concept, but it's really promising. And again, encourage all of you to sort of look into that. But that is what, let's not sort of take nature out of the equation because we've just sort of decided that nature is temporary. By the way, forests have been around forever and are one of the sort of, Charlotta Streck once said, like, it's disrespectful to nature to call it temporary. And I kind of believe that. But there is, there are these mechanisms that can sort of adapt to the risk, right, that people see of reversals and losses from the nature category.
John, can I add one more thing?
Sure.
This applies in the compliance market, but I think also in net zero claims. Folks often argue, some people often argue that, you can't offset a fossil emission with a nature-based emission. And I think that argument is strange to me because in the California program, if you emit, you can buy an allowance, and you can buy another allowance from emitting. So people can still emit. Like, we had a great conversation downstairs on the buyers coalitions for kind of buyers considerations and buyer coalitions around new different types of projects. And one of I'm forgetting the person's name, but someone from C2S was talking about kind of replacing coal in a country I'm forgetting now. And that's amazing. 19 million tons, I think she was saying, from the retirement of a coal plant. Someone could build a new coal plant in that same exact place. So I've never really understood the argument that somehow the fossil side is permanent and can't be offset with a nature-based credit.
Anything else on? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, mic drop.
Mic drop.
I couldn't do that as a government official, so now I'm like, yes.
Okay, well, to follow up on that, with the California program, well, not so much with the California program, but its predecessor with the Climate Action Reserve relied on 100-year contracts, between landowners and registries as a solid way to ensure project success. Of course, with the compliance program, you got the law on your side. But there it is. Jason, how would you like to respond to that? And also Pedro, as attorneys, are they a solid way to secure project success, just with a contract?
This was my question, I think. This is a little hard for me because I come from the compliance space where there weren't, there were contracts obviously between buyers and sellers, but the regulator was based on what the law says. And I think whether it's enforcing a contract provision or enforcing the law, the real thing that ensures project success is whether someone meets the technical requirements of the methodology. I think the ramifications from a regulatory standpoint, if you don't meet those requirements, the implications for you as a developer are can be much more severe than a contract. But I guess the premise of that question I don't quite understand because I think that the project success is based on meeting the requirements of the methodology.
Okay.
I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we have been speaking for like the last three months. But it does create problems from the legal point of view in the sense that us lawyers, we always work attending to a specific term. Any obligation needs to have a specific term. And a big problem with such a long term as 100 years is that there may be many local or subnational rules or for specific kinds of lands that 100-year commitment creates an enforcement problem. So that's the only thing that from the legal point of view, it's complicated.
And in Mexico, you have a case where 100-year contracts are?
Void, null and void. But that's also a matter of interpretation because in Mexico, you cannot compromise a ejido land for over 30 years for a third party. So what has been the discussion of the 100 years is that it's like a voluntary compromise of the ejido on its own to commit the land for preservation cases. This, of course, has brought different interpretations from different authorities, which we have a big mess in Mexico, that this is following not the environmental, but the agrarian law. And agrarian authorities have different offices in different states in Mexico, and it's kind of like none of those states had a unified vision in this regard. That's something that we are requesting a little bit of assistance from Semarnat right now to be a little bit of an intermediary to help us see how these rules are to be enacted. Nonetheless, since these kind of projects are tolerated at the very least by authorities, it has not been a real problem with the courts. but at least theoretically, it does bring a little of a problem. That's why, from a legal point of view, the less the legal term is, it's the easier to implement a project and to enforce the same.
Okay. I want to follow up on red projects. You know, you talk about and this is specific to Mexico, because of the 30-year limits on contracts. Maybe red doesn't need to rely so much on contracts the way projects do, but the question is also with the fact that illegal harvesting or deforestation is not legal in Mexico. So how does that put red projects at risk? Both the fact that maybe it relies on long-term contracts, maybe it doesn't, but also the fact that deforestation already isn't allowed. How do you provide credits for that? And that goes to Jason. I think you might want to respond to that as well.
What you speak about additionality, how you measure additionality? I mean, you have to go by what the deforestation rate is, because it's the same for landfills. When we made the first projects regarding landfills, you know, there's a standard regarding landfills that they have to have some methane recovery equipment, and not even the 1% landfills in Mexico have that. So you have to go to business as usual and how things are without the project to determine additionality. Even if, of course, it's illegal to remove trees in Mexico, you have to go to see what's happening without the project to determine additionality, which may be a problem. No, that's a real issue. But
my answer is the same. I mean, I think you need to look at what's actually happening on the ground. And I think taking a view that may work in Europe or the United States of what that looks like is different from when you're looking at other places. And I think the methodologies can be designed, as the REDD Plus methodologies have been, to look at how you set baselines and look at additionality perspectives. But
Okay, and this might be your last chance, audience, to offer a question to the audience. Has anybody got a burning one out there? A myth to be busted? Okay, then we're going, we have another, yes.
You had one question that was teed up for me, but not that I want to speak about just me speaking, but it was about whether there's sufficient money.
That's where I was going.
Okay, thank you.
So here's, yes, so here we go. And this is, Jason, you're going to be teed up on this one. Carbon markets have stepped up to the challenge by providing adequate finance to stop forest loss. And I bet you have something to say about that.
True. No, I'm just kidding. That, to me, that's obviously no, they have not. And I also don't think we should expect them to be the sole source of financing for this. But just for point of reference, I was doing a comment letter for the UN's the COP30 roadmap to reduce deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. In my comment letter, I put 3030, which is not the right thing to say. But just for a point of context, the Forest Declaration Assessment, which looks at what public commitments have actually come through from national governments to protect forests, the most recent one found that we need about 117 to 299 billion per year to protect forests. Orders of magnitude less, about 6 billion annually of that public commitment is coming forward. And then you look at the face of what's happening on investments in agriculture and other forest risk sectors, and the assessment found that there's about $409 billion annually in public subsidies that are going in a different direction from forest protection, and $9 trillion in private finance that's financing forest risk sectors. So carbon markets are a drop in the bucket, even with the most optimistic perspectives of what it could bring in. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. They're incredibly important catalytic funds. They can provide discretionary funding. But the scale of the financial challenge here is something I think it's forgotten in a lot of the critiques of methodologies and things. And I guess the mic drop I wanted to do was we have to address this, and it cannot just be with carbon market finance. We've got to find a way to stack different crediting mechanisms, whether that's through timber harvesting revenue or through other types of sources of funding. But that reality is something we have to grapple with.
And another way to do that is to scale the carbon market and make the market itself bigger, using some of the mechanisms that I talked about before to sort of make the carbon market more like the financial market, easier to transact, more seamless, more commodified.
drop.
Great. So okay, Pedro, you got a comment?
that's
Okay. We're getting close to the end of the session, but panelists, I want to make sure, since you have the audience here, that you've had a chance to express all of the things that you wanted to say. Jennifer, any last thoughts?
No, I don't think so. I think I said everything. Yeah.
Jason?
When are we going fishing, John?
Yeah. Okay, we can work on that.
Well, just finally, just keep on working with this. These are very important projects. At the end of the day, they do help communities, local communities, and they're the most important carbon projects in this regard. Please, there's a question there.
I have a quick question. How are you incentivizing forest companies to undertake these projects when a lot of them are just struggling to survive in kind of a changing world where we're moving to a lot of digital technology? What's the balance that they're striking?
I hope I get your question right. So how are we, through the carbon market, incentivizing landowners that are struggling, and what was the rest of it?
They're just struggling to survive given the move to digital, and they're trying to make different products and enter different sectors. How are you balancing, their priorities with just keeping their organizations going with undertaking carbon projects?
Okay. So how do forest landowners who are, forestry companies, okay, how do they engage in carbon markets when they are struggling to take care of just their basic needs and, basic operations? Anybody have a comment on that?
I mean, I used to, in a prior sort of life, I worked for a company that made and sold wood pellets, right? And at that time was sort of the rise of the carbon market, right? And it was interesting because it seemed like there could be competition between sort of growing more wood and leaving it on the stump, right, and getting paid for it in the market versus harvesting it and, selling it for whatever product, right? The wood, pellets are an interesting commodity because they're really just from pulpwood, so they're not actually sort of competing with saw timber. But I think that's a legitimate question, right? It's a real, as we sort of transform how we use our forests and what we're trying to accomplish with them, I do think that's an important question. It sounds like your forest companies are grappling with that just generally, right? Because there are changes in sort of how the forest land is used. One sort of thing I have heard, and this is, I'm not sort of endorsing this one way or the other, but you pay for what you value. Right? So if society values carbon storage, we would expect to see higher prices for those carbon credits, right? And in a way, I really believe in the market. Is it possible, right, question mark, that this problem or this sort of conundrum in a way would be solved by the market?
I think that's a pretty good word to end on. Unless, Jason, you have something absolutely burning, go for it.
Not burning. I see some timber company folks here, and I think the interesting thing about the stacking ability within a carbon market is, as long as you're meeting the methodology, you can still do timber harvesting in some different methodologies. And if you're giving more optionality to a timber company or to a landowner that brings in value in different ways, in particular, as Jen just said, like if we can get society to value the storage here more as it should be, I think that hopefully starts to give more options for what timber companies or landowners can do. You had a question on the digital piece, and I know there's other folks in here that are doing remote sensing and different tools to help reduce costs of actually monitoring, and I think that's a really exciting area to keep watching because there's a ton of work on that. I personally don't think that's going to mean that a timber company or landowner or the project developer still doesn't have to go out in the field occasionally, in particular on the social aspect of building those relationships. But I think that will start to bring cost, I think it has started to bring costs down for different projects, and there's folks I'm looking at, Florian here and others, that I think would be able to answer that question much better than I can.
Well, let's hear it for the panel. And I'd like y'all I'd like to invite y'all to join me for some snacks and maybe a drink before we go fishing.
Excellent.